Our friend Karen died a few months ago. And when her family was planning a memorial for her recently, I dug up an old story that I'd written in 2004 in which Karen played an important part. True story. We hadn't seen Karen for several years before her passing, or hadn't seen her or her family. But there was a time back in the day when our kids were young that we spent quite a deal of time together, great deal of time together. One of the things we did together was camping. Our family, Karen's family, and a third family we were very fond of. On one particular trip, on a beautiful autumn weekend, there's the theme, everybody. I hit the theme. One particular camping trip on a beautiful autumn weekend. The three families had rented a couple of campsites in Butano State Park in the Redwoods, about an hour south of San Francisco, and a mile or two from the ocean. We had had a really fun day. We went for a walk in the Redwoods down by the creek in the morning, then we went into Santa Cruz and wandered around the boardwalk, ate a lot of junk food, rode roller coasters, came back eventually to our campsite, and we realized the day was not over yet. Now there were 12 of us on the trip, three families, each with two parents and two teenage kids. But when we saw what was going on at the campsite, in the campsite right next to us, there were three guys speaking Russian or some Slavic language who were partying loud party. They were drinking, they were singing, they were yelling, they were having a great time. But it was also after 10 o'clock at night. Now, camping in a state park is an exercise in trust. It's like a little village without walls. But there didn't seem to be anyone around to enforce the regulations. Signs posted prominently everywhere. Quiet hours, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. This was after 10, and there was anything but quiet happening. So we were a little discouraged by this, despite the noise. Now, the three couples were Karen and her husband Hank, Cheryl and Victor, and Susan and me. And we each had our two teenagers. Excuse me. Got to lubricate. And the kids were Ben and Chase, Rosie and Danny, Jonathan and Lauren. So, John, I hope you're taking notes on all this. When we got back to the campsite and the noise was going on, the moms, Cheryl, Susan, and Karen, were all very tired and went right to bed despite the noise. The kids all stayed up with a lantern on the picnic table in our site playing a board game. The dads, Vic, Hank, and I, sat around poking at the fire, which is what dads like to do, chatting a little bit, but mostly poking at the fire. And the noise was unrelenting. Alcohol-enhanced glee was flooding over us from the next campsite. We could hear the clink of beer bottles, and they were singing and they were yelling. They seemed very happy. We weren't sure what was going on. Eventually, we decided to go to bed. And before we did, I looked over at the next campsite and I went, shh. No response. And I wondered whether they even spoke English. And I wondered, is shh English, or is it a cultural thing that people don't understand, or does it mean something really different in other languages? I still don't know. But after we brushed our teeth, Hank and I went over to talk to the Russians, if they were Russians. And we explained that the quiet hours were in force. It was already after 11 o'clock at that point, and they really needed to calm down. And they were very, very drunk, but friendly. And they would say, yeah, sure, we understand. They'd be quiet. Okay, it's okay. So we went and got into bed, and I tried for an hour to go to sleep, but the Russians couldn't control their volume. When we were talking to them, one of them kept trying to say something to me I just couldn't understand. The only word I could pick up was celebration. And I wondered what they were celebrating. They were all crew cut, young, much younger than all of us, and very muscular. And we were thinking, is this a wrestling team? Who are these people? What are they celebrating anyway? So I got into bed and I tried to sleep, but the Russian beer bash burbled over and got louder and louder and louder. There's nothing I can do to stop it. After about an hour, I heard Karen unzip her tent, and I opened the flap of our tent. I watched her get out of the tent and shine a very powerful flashlight on the Russians, who stopped talking immediately. It's time to go to bed, gentlemen, she said, in her most authoritative mom voice. Nobody can sleep. You have to be quiet. It's time to go to sleep. Silence. For about 5 seconds. And then from out of the gloom, and these people had no fire and no light. Fortunately, there was just enough moonlight that they could see to not walk into trees. But out of the gloom, the voice said, "Can we have 1/2 hour more?" No! I screamed. It's already after midnight. You can't have half an hour more. You're already past the late, we're in the quiet hours and nobody can sleep. You have to go to bed. This is terrible. And they quieted down for a few minutes. And then after, I heard Karen go over to the boys who were still playing their board game, tell them to go to bed and turn off the lantern, hoping that complete darkness might get the Russians to calm down. Didn't work. Pretty soon it got louder and louder. They were all yelling and singing and screaming at each other in amazing tones, and they seemed to be very happy. They all had identical resonant baritone voices. They all talked at the same time, and they never ran out of things to say. So what were we supposed to do? Eventually, they did go to bed. Well, 2 of them went to bed. The third one sat up for hours, and every 20 minutes or so we'd hear him scream at the top of his lungs, "Motherfucker! Fuck you, motherfucker!" During the night, why? Who knows? During the night, Susan went to the restroom, and she found one of the Russian guys in the ladies' room. She said, "Get out of here! You can't be in here! Get out! This is the ladies' room." "That's okay," he said. He was kind of unsteady on his feet, slurring his speech. "That's okay. I like ladies." And just then, one of his comrades reached in from the doorway, grabbed him by the collar, and yanked him out of there without further incident. But the whole encounter really shook Susan up. Later, we learned that they had done some vandalism. They'd broken a light bulb in the men's room, and they started a small fire in the ladies' room. At least we thought they did. Nobody had actually seen them do it. The next morning, a park ranger came by to investigate. He'd already talked to some of the other campsites, and he knew about the disturbance, and we were the ones closest to the Russians. And he said he was planning to throw them out of the campground. We all shared our stories of cross-cultural outrage and watched as he went over to their campsite. He pulled his truck up in front to block their cars so they couldn't get out. And then he woke them up and confronted them. And he asked for ID. And apparently one of the guys gave him a false ID, which enraged the ranger. "No, you can't just leave now. This has now become a law enforcement situation." And I watched the ranger and I thought about it. He was a skinny guy with gray hair and a very loud voice. And he stood there with his hands on his hips and a nightstick under his arm. And I wondered, what happens if they don't want to cooperate? And then I realized the ranger was packing heat. He had a gun. Fortunately, the gun stayed in his holster. And I noticed how he deftly stepped aside to avoid getting trapped between 2 of the Russians who were now up and about, but walking around in dazed morning after confusion, very hungover, not really sure what to do. We watched as one of the Russians walked right past us to dump some garbage as they were trying to break camp and leave, which the ranger wanted them to do. He wouldn't meet our eyes, but I noticed this guy had more gray hair than the others. Maybe he was the coach of the wrestling team. We didn't know. But they were all, So eventually, the guy with the false ID produced a real ID, because the ranger said, "Either you give me a genuine identification or I'm going to lead you away from here in handcuffs." He was very serious. Now, incongruously at this time, the 12 of us were 40 feet away having a breakfast feast. French toast, chicken apple sausage, scrambled eggs with onions, melon, coffee, tea, juice, hot chocolate. The Russians were walking around looking very hungover and really forlorn, and we started to feel a little sorry for them. The ranger continued to yell, and he finally got a genuine ID from the guy, which turned out to be a California driver's license that had been suspended, but it was still a valid driver's license. He issued the guy a citation for presenting the false ID. He cited him for interfering with a peace officer. And we were kind of wondering what to do, and Cheryl at this point said, maybe we should offer them breakfast, which was actually just what I was thinking. And Susan looked at her and said, wow, you don't have a vindictive bone in your body, do you? And she didn't. Just about that time, 2 sheriff's deputies drove up in squad cars to back up the ranger. The ranger had called for backup. And at that point, Karen walked over to the Russians' campsite and said, these men should be ashamed of themselves. They kept everyone up last night with their partying. They wouldn't go to bed. They wouldn't quiet down. One of the deputies said, back away, lady, reflecting the mounting tension. Now, pretty soon, the ranger moved his truck, and the deputies escorted the Russians' cars back to the highway, and then for a number of miles up Highway 1. As they drove away, the ranger yelled at them, you are not welcome to come back here, ever. And they didn't. Then the ranger came over to our campsite to chat with us, and he refused breakfast, and he discussed the case amiably. He explained that the Russians had no reservation. They hadn't registered or paid for their campsite. Because nobody had actually seen them do the vandalism in the bathroom, he couldn't cite them for that. So their punishment for the racket was being ejected from the campground after paying for the campsite that they had occupied. This kind of thing only happens about once a year, the ranger told us. But if this ever happens again, go to use the payphone at the park entrance and dial 911, and the dispatcher will send out a ranger or a sheriff's deputy, even in the middle of the night. And he looked at all of us and he said, you shouldn't have to deal with people like this yourselves. We all agreed with him about that. When he was threatening them earlier in the encounter, things were getting kind of tense. And Cheryl was saying, I don't really like this Homeland Security version of rangering. And Ben said, maybe they wouldn't be so hung up on IDs if these guys weren't foreigners. And we all started to have mixed feelings about that encounter. But by now they were gone. Ranger said, call from the payphone. Danny, my son Danny, pointed out that the payphone was broken. And there was no cell service. And the ranger explained that there were other rangers living in the park. And he explained how to find them, but how could we have possibly known that at the time? So eventually we thanked him and he headed out. And we had a really fun day and spent a lot of time rehashing what had happened the night before and the aftermath. Hank said, I don't hate those guys. I just think they were stupid. Driving with a suspended license and then calling so much attention to themselves, stupid. Jonathan, his son, said, did you hear that guy yelling, motherfucker, during the night? I think he was chasing away the raccoons. And we discovered that the raccoons had stolen food from us and had demonstrated a very deft ability to open potato chip bags. Who knew? So we had a nice day after that. We went to a Mexican restaurant in town, and by the time we came out, we were exploring different, how can I say this, different ways of saying the word flan. Flan? Flan. 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 And to this day, the 12 of us who were on that camping trip, or 11 now that Karen has passed away, still see each other 20 years later and go, flan? Flan. Flan. Lawrence loved to at random times during the day, Lawrence entertained us by yelling out, "Motherfucker!" And anytime he did that, it was always a surprise. That evening, the 12 of us were sitting around the picnic table in our campsite. The Russians were gone. And we were playing a board game, a really zany board game called Moods. And the way the game worked was the person whose turn it was drew a card, and there was a sentence on it they were supposed to read. And then they threw a die, and the die would determine the mood that they were supposed to read it with, and we were supposed to guess the mood. So Susan drew a card that said, "My underwear is too tight," which she was supposed to say enviously. Then Lawrence drew a card that said, "Don't touch that, it's dirty," which he was supposed to say in a silly way, but instead he said, "Don't touch that, it's silly." And we all laughed, and we were having a really good time. At about 5 minutes to 10, a different ranger came up and reminded us that quiet hours were about to start. And we all chuckled and realized suddenly we were the loudest thing in the campground. We hugged each other and all went to bed. And pretty soon, the little village without walls was quiet again. Thank you. I have to tell you, when I first unearthed this story, I sent it to Hank, Karen's husband, and to her two sons, Jonathan and Lawrence. And I said, "I'd really like to read this story at Karen's memorial, but I don't want to do something inappropriate. It's got some salty language in it. Motherfucker." In case you remember. You got that? It's got some salty language in it, and I don't want to do anything inappropriate or disrespectful, especially if it's going to be a solemn occasion. Well, Hank wrote back immediately and he said, "Please read this story. If anyone thinks that the language is offensive, they're at the wrong memorial. Read on." Karen would have loved it. And so I did. And it was not a solemn occasion. It was a joyous occasion. Everybody telling wonderful stories about Karen, her loving nature, and her unique personality. And it just fit right in. So thank you very much.